Okay, so this is my workshop. I captured my garage many years ago. And as you can see, it's simple, very compact, tried to make it really, really organized. And so we'll kind of we'll walk through it and head toward a shelf, and I'm going to share some of the work that I introduced to you today. So come on in.
This poor connection.
So you're getting a glimpse of some of the figures and some of the materials are in my workshop on the way. As you can see, I've got lots of figures. Over the last 3 years, I literally have done over 100 of these. They just keep kind of evolving, popping into my brain, and I've been bringing them to life. So I'm going to show you where I started. Very, very, very simply. For a lot of years, I've been fascinated with humans. Not so much their physical appearance, but their inner world, and tried to find ways to express that in my art. So about 3 years ago, I'd been doing a lot of really detailed acrylic portraits on wood panels, and they just didn't seem to connect with people. They connected with me and with the person pictured, but not to people in general. So I've always enjoyed working with wood, and so one day I just started to try, how can I simplify the human being, still recognizable, but take it down to its essence. So I started out just with these simple figures, very stoic, maybe a witness or a sage. I draw a lot on primitive art, on folk art, especially US and Central and South American. I love Mexican folk art. So I started to create these kind of sentinels, and I did 3 or 4 of them, and they really, for me, started to speak not only about being human, but what happens as we age. And I love this wood. I love the character of wood, because I think it brings stories to the creation in and of itself. So I started to develop these. And a lot of the pieces, especially initially, the wood had personal stories for me. This is an old, if you know what an Indian pin is, an old exercise pin from the YMCA, probably around 1930 or 40. When we closed the Newburgh Y, I saved this and thought someday I'm going to find a use for it. And it just made an elegant, elegant body for this simple person. And it started to get a little more complex. I particularly like this piece. I can remember the wood that this is from. It's from an old firebox from a women's center, the Grail in Cornwall, that they had abandoned. And I asked for it, and I knew this knot would make an incredible torso. For me, these pieces evoke stories. And I'm going to share the story that I remember vividly about this piece. So I had an opening. I asked people after the opening to pick up a piece, spend some time with it, and then talk about how they connected with it. So a friend of ours who had had a severe stroke quite a few years ago and had some real language limitations went over, picked this one up, spent some time with it. And when it was time for him to share, he said very simply, I had a stroke, and he took his hand, I'm not whole anymore. And it just really captured my heart, because I realized that this really spoke to him about the challenges he was having in his life. And yet he's still functioning, he's still standing tall. Back of an old oak chair. I love to build in metaphors into a lot of the pieces. And in this particular one, I included a drawer with a pretty substantial lock on it. So maybe we have secrets. Maybe we have secrets we tuck away, or we have things that we don't want to share because we're afraid somebody will take them or deny them. So this piece really spoke to that. Occasionally I put something in there, a chart of pottery or something, but sometimes I just leave it empty and let people make up their own minds about what's in there. This was a real provocative piece. I remember my wife came down into my workshop after I had just finished it and was really uneasy with it. And it really is kind of meant to be uneasy. You know, what happens when internally we feel pulled apart? We feel rended into two pieces. We feel split. And this kind of evokes that. I put a little key here. And I remembered one day a young friend came, and she came down to the workshop, and she looked at this for quite a while and finally said, if I turn this key, will this come back together? And I love that wish and that dream that we could heal that easily. But that's what this piece is about, is how do we go on when we've been split in two internally? How do we pull ourselves back together when life has presented us with real challenges? This one spoke to me on a lighter note. And again, this is the top of an old baking soda tin. And it had been banging around in our basement for years. And one day I decided I wanted to do something a little lighter, a little more jovial. And for some reason, that just fit as the wonderful center, as the torso, and it's studded with stars. Again, a lot of these pieces have personal stories for me. So this ring around the neck, kind of this clown-like colored ring, was part of a toy that my grandsons had here when they were very young. And when they came over, they would always go for these. So this was part of a cement mixer. So for me, this brings back lots of wonderful memories. But I'm fascinated by what it also evokes in people that don't know that personal story. Some of you may have seen this piece when I had my exhibit at Ask in Kingston in February. And it's one of my favorites. If you're familiar with contemporary sculpture, I realized that Alberto Giacometti had done a very wiry long figure with these wheels through the legs. That didn't inspire this, but it reminded me of it. Along the way, I wanted to create a human that reflected for me someone with a physical disability. But I realized the last thing I wanted to do is have that person seated and dependent completely on and reclined in that chair. So I said, well, I'll make the person standing tall, put the wheels through the legs, because I think if you have a disability, you don't want to be defined by it. And so in this case, I'm here, I'm standing tall, yes, I need the supports, but I'm moving forward. As I've shared this with people, some people have completely different interpretations. One person saw it and said, that's me, I'm mobile, I'm always on the move. I need to have my van or my car, I need to be able to move and move on. Somebody else said, that's me, I feel like I'm on a treadmill and I just can't catch up. So for me, part of the power of these is the stories people bring to them. And this one has evoked a lot of different stories. This piece connects understandably with people who've grown up in urban settings, who are steeped in the mortar and the steel and the conduit and the wiring and the piping that's part of urban life. It's all around you. And so what's it like when you morph the habitat somebody lives in and their existence? So this was a provocative one, and I laid the bricks. These are little miniature bricks and kind of a fine cement. So it was interesting to actually build this. Finally, I had, quite often I don't have a specific intention in mind, but when I created this one, I had in mind Nelson Mandela. My wife and I had come back from a trip to South Africa, and I had a chance to visit several sites, including Robben Island. And so, for me, again, the strength of that man, the power of that man, and how he overcame, and for me, this was prison bars, how he overcame that and came out not an A, 46664. And that was actually Mandela's prison cell number. So as time went on, this series continued to evolve, and I just sought different materials, different metaphors to reflect in these simple sculptures. So with that introduction, I'm going to take the camera here, and I'm going to kind of give you a quick tour around the studio. First the materials and then the tools. And if you haven't noticed already, I'm a collector. If we're out driving and I see something or my wife points something out, we'll stop, we'll pick it up. I love the character of old chairbacks. I love the turns and spindles of old cradles and bassinets. And I love old wood. The piece on the right is actually from a barn on the Grail property, and it's been there, it was there forever, and I just loved the knottiness, the character, the scarring, the knots. The piece on the left is a piece of driftwood that I salvaged from the Hudson River. So, obviously I'm a collector, not only of wood, but also of findings. Of all the raw materials that might end up in one of my sculptures. So sometimes the process begins with an idea in my mind. Sometimes it begins with just looking at materials and finding an inspiration in the materials. And lots of possibilities for heads. I keep Michael's busy. And I've intentionally, early on, I decided that I didn't want features, that I wanted a universal, generic shape that would be recognized as a head, but wouldn't begin to define that person. So these spheres stained to different tones to match the rich range of our races and complexions. So the raw materials. One of the things that's pretty evident is, though I work on a micro scale, a lot of the tools that I need to use are macro. So bandsaw, jigsaw, there's a radial saw, my table saw, which doubles as a workspace, little belt sander, drill press. So I'm fascinated as I work to go from those large tools that create the rough shapes to then the finer tools that help me get the detail. I use a lot of clamps. Sometimes my pieces will have 8 or 10 different clamps holding pieces together. So clamps, drills, sanders, Dremel tool. Fine carving tools. Small files. I spend a lot of time, and it's amazing how much I use this. It's something as simple as an X-Acto knife. I go through dozens of X-Acto blades. And quarts of wood glue. And even some fascinating tools. I love these Japanese saws that I just found recently, and they've been great to use. So taking those tools and those materials, I start to bring into shape the figures that evoke the human condition. So I'm going to give this back to my wife. And I want to introduce you to the Saint series, which has really captured my imagination over the last probably year and a half. And the Saint series started out, interestingly enough, not with saints, but with some simple angels. And I love the play in this between the dark and the light, the contradictions, the dichotomies that we all feel, and how some people manage to transcend those. A little more traditional angel. Interestingly, the wings, and sometimes it's serendipity, the wings I actually found in Michael's, and they were really gaudy. They were covered with glitter, they were covered with gold, but I bought them anyway. They were on sale. I brought them home, and I took a torch, and I burnt off and brushed off all the glitter and gold, and found these lovely burnished metal tones. So this angel really evolved out of a fascination with those wings. The weathered wood, recycled wood, a lot of detail in this. I love rusty barbed wire, and I love the look of that as part of a bouquet. So there's always kind of a balance between whimsical and kind of edgy, maybe even a little dark and menacing, because I think that's the world that we live in, that has that balance. On the other end of the scale, not only looking at life and transcendence, but mortality and death. And this is something that is completed during this time of COVID-19. It was one of the first pieces I created when we started to be isolated at home. And those of you that know Mexican folk art will kind of recognize the style here, kind of the Dia del Muerte, kind of claiming death and realizing it's inevitable and making it part of life. So as I started to explore that, I realized that I'm really fascinated by, well, it could be a saint, could be out of the Christian tradition, it could be a bodhisattva out of the Buddhist tradition, or in Islam they have the term Ali, or friend of God. But human beings who have sacrificed and who have transcended out of their lower self and aspire to be in their greatest potential. So the first saints were more well known. So I think this is pretty recognizable. St. Francis, and that's actually the church that my wife and I got married in Newburgh, St. Francis Church. But like many people, he's always captured me, his affinity for the natural world, for animals. So, and I love the wood tones. I love just the variations in wood. And these aren't painted on. That's all the woods the way I found it, from old crates, old barnwood, but just kind of lovingly put together. And this is really the first time that I've tried to create animals, and so I had a lot of fun trying to create the animals in the same style and add them to him. So we've got St. Francis. Another familiar one, St. Patrick. On my father's side, I'm Scotch-Irish, so I've always had an affinity for Irish and Celtic culture. And this was a challenge because he is so stereotyped. How did I kind of make him more original? So I tried to pare it down to the bare bones of that green cloak, the beard, the shamrock, just the symbolism. And then, of course, the serpent, who legend has it, he forced the serpents out of Ireland. A lesser-known saint, but one that one of the three patron saints of Ireland is Saint Bridget, who actually who evolved from and draws on the Celtic goddess Brigid, and the patron saint of poetry, the patron saint of blacksmiths, the patron saint of home and hearth. But I really tried to capture a sense of Ireland and Irish countryside, so her cloak becomes the fields of Ireland. even straws in her dress, or the whisk straws, the grain. The hearth becomes part of her torso, the flame over it. And then, if you're familiar with Bridget, there's Bridget's cross, St. Bridget's cross in the background, typically made out of woven sheaves of wood or cane. This is St. James, or as he is known in Spain, Santiago. Santiago is the patron saint of Spain. So this one has particular meaning for my wife and I, because some of you may be familiar with the Camino de Santiago, which is the pilgrimage route that St. James walked as he established churches across Spain. And my wife and I have the Camino, and the final leg you actually end up in Santiago de Compostela, which is where St. James is buried. But I really wanted to try to capture the spirit not only of St. James, Santiago, but of Spain. And there's a lot of symbolism here. If you walk the Camino, clamshell. So the clamshell is so often associated with the pilgrims or peregrinos that walk the Camino as a pilgrimage, as they've done for hundreds of years. And quite often, as a pilgrim, you carry a clamshell in your pack to indicate that you're there on pilgrimage. The gourd is the old water bottle, using a hollowed gourd to carry your water. So whenever I look at this, I think of our own pilgrimage, our own journey on that route. Started to research lesser known saints. And again, this is an Irish saint. This is Saint Dymphna, who I had never heard of, but her story really intrigued me. Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of the oppressed, of people who struggle with mental illness, people who are oppressed. And as the story goes, Saint Dymphna was an only daughter. Her mother died. Her father was so inconsolable, and he searched for a woman to replace her, and the only woman he could find was his daughter. And when his daughter realized what was going on, she fled. She fled the country. And he followed her. He confronted her. She stood up to him. But eventually he killed her. But she's become a symbol of standing up to oppression, standing up to force. And I tried hard. If you look closely at this, she's soft and she's firm. She's standing tall. She has that sword. The sword is actually piercing the devil, who she has under control, who she has chained. But she also is holding those lilies, holding the soft flowers. And as I've done in a couple of my sculpture, you notice that her torso is a window to her inside world, and it's shattered. That's become a powerful metaphor in a number of my pieces, and I thought it was appropriate to use here. So again, as I create these, I try to strip them down to the basics, and really in kind of an iconic, archetypal form, try to create the spirit of the saint. So there is Dymphna. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you a look into my process, how it begins, how it evolves, and how it eventually leads to some kind of a spark. So in this case, my wife had been on Facebook, and she said, "Did you realize that there's a Saint Corona?" Which I didn't, and that remarkably she is the patron saint of epidemics and pandemics. And that caught my attention. I said, I need to learn more about this saint, because it can become a rich idea to explore and bring to life in this time of COVID-19. So, as I often do, I started to do some research on the internet. And I found not a lot of information. There's not a lot written about St. Corona, but here are some of the images that I found. And I actually included a close-up of the coronavirus. Decided not to use that literally, but you'll see how I used it symbolically. So here's the story. Here's what I found out about St. Corona, an Italian saint often associated with St. Victor. And as the legend goes, St. Victor was persecuted as a Christian, and he was brutally murdered. He was martyred. Corona was so inspired by his bravery that she disclosed her religious faith too. She had kept it hidden. And when that happened again, so she was captured, she was tortured, and suffered a pretty brutal death. So when you see this image of her on the shield, she was literally tied. Two palm trees were brought together. So there was tension. She was suspended between them, and then they released the tension, and it literally rendered her apart. I can't find any evidence of why she is associated with epidemics and pandemics, but the irony of having a saint who was transcendent, who overcame in this time of COVID-19, really captured my imagination. So as I often do, once I've steeped myself in images, I start to sketch. So this came pretty quickly, and you can see how closely I drew on the images that I found in my research. So here's my first sketch, and you notice there's a couple palm fronds at the bottom, and she's suspended. She's kind of hanging there. I did not want to replicate the brutal murder, but I wanted to replicate what she transcended. So instead of those two palm trees, I created that large X and suspended her in front of it. The corona became her halo. So you see that behind her. So once I've got this kind of conceptual drawing, I scale it up and create a kind of a pattern. So this is the pattern for the figure. So I got, I get a sense of size and scale, and you can see how closely this reflects my initial sketch. One of the dynamic movements of this, and I captured that first in giving her this big wave, this big movement in her gown, and then reflecting it in the tail of her headband. Tall, very, very thin, strong, arms raised, and then the corona as a halo. So once I've got this in place, I start very basically and very literally. So here is the body core. And this is not recycled, reclaimed wood. This will all be covered over. But this is an easy material to work with to cut and shape. So you can see that basic shape. So, covering that with a thin layer of wood. And there's a story behind this wood. At one point, I had created a sculptural piece for a women's center, and it was in a grotto, an open-fronted grotto. We built doors out of cedar to close the grotto, and when the center closed, I reclaimed the figures and I reclaimed that wood, saving it. And this is actually shaved down, trimmed down from those door panels. So that story stays with me, and whether other people know it or not, becomes imbued in, part of the power and significance of this piece. So once I've got this core, there's that simple head. And anticipating the halo, I sanded down the back. I don't rely just on glue, so there's a lot of metal pins and screws that hold. Starting. Let it evolve. It's interesting, as I push this in, you notice that pin is a little off. And that's okay. Sometimes these things take on a life of their own. So as it goes in, if it canters the leg a little, if it angles it a little bit, that's fine, because we're not perfect as humans, and my sculptures, I try not, kind of let them evolve and take their own shape if needed. So I start to create that, start to find the detail. Okay, the wood piece that becomes the belt. This has to be carved and sanded, but here's the piece of pine that becomes that sweep. Here's another piece of pine that gets cut on a jigsaw and becomes the halo. So the core piece gradually emerges. So I have that. Okay, there's that background piece. Okay, there's that, not a cross, but an X. And as you'll see when you see the finished piece, I think for me, a lot of the power of this piece comes, and I attach the figure to the back with wooden dowels, so it kind of floats. And so that sense of floating, lifting up, becomes really an important part of it. So once I've got it this far, it starts to take on an interesting life, because I have to make this kind of decisions on the fly. So I'm going to show you the finished piece. So you can see what happens when you start to add pigment. I was tempted to leave the dress in the raw form, but something about the need for that white, the purity and the sacredness of an airiness of white became really important. And you can see what an important element that swoosh in the dress became, how that's reflected in the headband, and the corona, the crown, the flames around the sun. So, it speaks to me. And if you look at just that little bit of space, just the fact that she's lifted up off the ground, she's suspended. So for me, when I create these saints, I'm thinking about humans who've transcended, humans who have made their life beyond the normal. They've been heroic, they've been challenged, they've responded. And I didn't want to focus on her death as much as the sacrifice and her transcendence. A subtle detail, and this came at the end, okay? Knowing that she had been suspended to those trees, the victory of having those little reminders of her death and the sacrifice, that how they're just so light and they don't bound her or hold her down anymore. So my work more and more becomes about how do we give form to our inner world? How do we give form to the struggles that we have? And hopefully what I find is that people can find the stories and messages they need to in their own life as they view my Simply Human figures, my saints, and we'll continue to help people think, talk with each other, question, but also make some discoveries and find the courage and strength to be heroic in their own life. So, my journey as an artist is to be continued. I look forward to sharing what I do in future weeks and months. This time of COVID-19 has been an incredibly powerful time. I think I'm going to show you one more piece before we say farewell. And similar but different. So again, this I did just over the last couple of weeks.
So you could see the...
Okay. So this is part of a Nature's Chaos series. And you can see how it has the same origins and roots that my humans do. Again, that love of raw wood, reclaimed wood, recycled wood. And the wing, to me, there's just an absolutely elegant natural structure. So again, there's a kind of an element of transcendence here, but in the natural world, out of the chaos and order and threats of the natural life, how can we transcend? How can we arise up? So I'm finding different vehicles, different media to kind of express that same message. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me. You're the first people that have really come and been able to see my studio and see my process. So I look forward to hearing and seeing other artists as they go through this series, and hope that you stay safe and well. Take care.